Even though I grew up in a small town, I still feel like I had a pretty eventful childhood. I mean, there wasn't much to do around us, but what little we had felt like the world. We had really cool hiking trails and places to ride our bikes and even some great swimming spots. But one thing in our area that affected every generation that grew up there was the creepy abandoned motel that was just on the outskirts of the town. Now, as an adult, I can be almost certain that the motel wasn't actually haunted. But at some point in all of our lives, we believed that it was truly a place that had a dark essence within it. It's unclear when or how the rumor started, but as every kid in our town grew up, we all heard stories about people that have died in the motel, and that this was why they had to close it down. And according to the stories, it was the ghosts of the people who were killed there that haunted the place. This was something that even as a kid I thought was kind of ridiculous, but it became a tradition for the young people that were transitioning from 5th to 6th grade to try and spend the night in or around the motel. And during the summer that I was meant to spend a night in there, we didn't actually have a large group. It was just me and my 2 friends who actually decided that we would stay there. We figured that it would be just like camping, especially since we were sure that nothing was going to happen to us. I'll tell you what though, we definitely ate our words that night. It was about 2 weeks before school started back up. My friend Dylan, his cousin Matt, and I began to set up our tents in the small field between the motel and the woods behind it. We decided that we would spend time in some of the rooms to see how creepy it was, but didn't want to sleep inside because the floor was really gross from what we knew. So we figured that camping in the field would be better for us. Plus, it's easier to pitch a tent in the grass anyways. And after setting all of our stuff up, we grabbed our flashlights and made our way inside one of the rooms that had an open door. The room smelled horrible, and you could see mold growing everywhere from the rainwater that had managed to get inside. So we ended up moving on from that room really quickly. As we made our way around the motel, we noticed that it was getting really dark really quickly, and figured that we should be extra careful when walking around. We started to shine our flashlights more toward the ground so we could see where we were walking, and that's when I first heard it. As soon as my eyes weren't facing forward and I was looking down, I noticed a tapping sound that seemed like it was coming from the balcony railing on the floor above us. I immediately stopped in place and pointed my flashlight toward the noise, but oddly enough, there was nothing there. I asked my friends if they had heard anything, and to my surprise, Matt replied by asking, "Do you mean that scratching noise?" Chills ran down my spine as I realized that we had both heard something, but they were 2 very different sounds. I explained that I heard tapping coming from the floor above us, and Matt claimed that the scratching he heard was coming from behind our group. All 3 of us tried our best not to look freaked out, but we couldn't help it. We decided that we would go in one last room so that we didn't look like total wusses. But after that, we would spend the rest of the nights near our tents. I wish we had just given up there though. The 3 of us made our way down the line of doors, testing each one to see if they would open, and on the second try we managed to find an unlocked room. When we opened the door, we noticed that this time the room wasn't covered in water and mold, but it was still pretty disheveled. We all stepped into the room and began looking around, but all of our curiosity left our bodies when the door to the room slammed shut behind us. The force of the door closing felt as if it shook the room, and it was immediately followed by what sounded like screaming and pounding from multiple sides of the room. We all looked around frantically trying to figure out what was going on, but because we were so young, all we could think about was the possibility of ghosts. I ran over to the door and tried to turn the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The banging noises continued to get louder and louder, and by that point, we would have done anything to get out of that room. And that's exactly what we did. I looked over to Dylan, who was in the process of grabbing one of the beaten up chairs that was left in the room. He grabbed the chair and threw it as hard as he could at the window, and thankfully the chair went right through. The screaming and pounding stopped almost as soon as the glass shattered, and the 3 of us didn't waste any time getting out of that room. We decided to grab our things as fast as we could and packed up our tents before leaving. The entire time we were all really tense as we thought that we could hear talking coming from the wooded area behind the motel, but we packed as quickly as we could and left that place never to go back. It wasn't until like 3 years later that we learned from my older brother that it was actually his friends messing with us, but at the time, we were all deathly scared of that motel. It was the summer of 2009, and my brother asked me to help him out with a film project that he was working on back in our hometown. We grew up in this small town in the middle of Wisconsin that seemed to be surrounded by nothing but woods. And growing up, We had all heard rumors about this local hiking trail and how it was supposedly so terrifying at night that despite it looking like a great place to camp, no one ever managed to spend the night. None of us ever really understood why, but for a school project, my friend Dakota asked if I would camp out with him so that we could document our experiences. By that point in my life, I had only ever gone on a hike through that area while it was broad daylight out, and under the sunlight, it was a really pleasant experience, but after nightfall, it was an entirely different story. Dakota and I made our way out into the woods on the public hiking trail that led us to an intersecting trail that eventually took us to the section of the woods that everyone was so afraid of. And even though we showed up just before sundown, under the cover of the trees, the world around us got dark very quickly. We both had our flashlights on us, which made setting up our two-person tent pretty easy even though there was hardly any visibility. And before long, we had a fire going to relax around. Dakota pulled his camera out and began filming the area through a night vision lens as the two of us just told stories about the town and the people that we grew up with. Honestly, it started out as a pretty pleasant night, but in a matter of seconds, that all changed. The two of us were sitting enjoying the heat cascading from the bouncing flames when all of a sudden, we heard a loud crashing sound followed by heavy breathing. And before either of us had a chance to react, a large buck came crashing out the tree line and ran almost right through our fire pit. As the buck ran out of our camp, the two of us stood up and looked at each other. I had never been that close to a deer before, and what made things even stranger was that it seemed to almost have no interest in us at all. The two of us tried to calm ourselves down a bit and laugh the situation off, but before we could even get back down in our seats, we heard the sound of something crunching in the distance. It sounded as if something had stepped on a small branch or stick, and because I was afraid that it was a bear or something, I immediately reached for the flashlight that was sitting beside my chair and pointed it in the direction of the noise. The hair on the back of my neck was standing up as I tried to look out into the woods, but I couldn't see anything. That was when I looked over to Dakota and saw him pointing his camera toward the woods. I asked him if he could see anything, but he didn't answer. I snapped my fingers to get his attention, and without saying anything, he just looked at me and passed his camera over. I grabbed it and then used the night vision function to look out into the woods, and what I saw almost made me jump right out of my seat. Standing what looked like 30 feet away from us was a figure that appeared to be standing upright. Now we can't confirm this, but to both of us, it looked like a man peering out from behind a tree. "What do we do?" Dakota asked quietly. We both knew that we were too afraid to call out to whoever was watching us from the forest around us, but we knew that we couldn't let them keep doing it either. Since neither of us could muster up the courage to call out for them though, we both decided that we should just leave. We figured that we could leave our gear in the woods and come back for it in the morning. All we really needed was our car keys, flashlights, and Dakota's camera equipment. We gathered as much as we could without moving too much so we could keep our focus on the man behind the tree. But when the time came, all we could do was stand from our seats, douse the fire with water, and run as fast as we could to the car. As soon as the water hit the fire, I remember clear as day the sound of whoever it was moving through the woods. Dakota and I could hear the sound of the sticks crunching underneath him as he took a step forward. That was when the two of us booked it, and we didn't stop running until we reached the parking lot at the end of the public trail. We showed multiple people around town the video that Dakota got on his camera, and no one can say that they recognized the green blur that we saw, but almost everyone agrees that it looked like a person that was out in the woods with us that night. One of the few cool things that the town that I grew up in ever did was host an annual harvest festival for the town, where everyone set up booths to sell products from their farms. It was usually a very wholesome experience, and as a kid, the games that they had there were always a blast. Even the hayride was fun from time to time, even though it was basically just riding around the town in the back of a pickup truck with hay in it. Sadly, as many of the good memories came from the Harvest Festival, there's still one that haunts me to this day and will probably stick with me for the rest of my life. I was 9 years old, and it was the first year that I had been allowed to wander off by myself. Mind you, my parents were still very close by, but I was able to go to any booth without asking their permission or needing them to follow me. The first place I went to was the fudge booth, where I promptly spent all of the money that my dad had given me, and then I immediately turned around to look for my parents to see if I could squeeze a few more bucks out of them. But when I looked around, at first glance I couldn't see them. I started walking around and looking past as many groups of people as I could to see if I could spot my dad's Mets hat or my mom's big red glasses that she was wearing, but for some reason, I couldn't find them. I tried not to panic, but I guess I had a worrisome look on my face because it wasn't long before a woman who looked to be a bit younger than my mom came up to me and asked if I was all right. I explained that I was just looking for my parents and she kindly offered to help me. Although, as we both began walking in the direction where I had last seen my parents, her kindness slowly started getting strange as I felt her grab my hand. Now, at first, I thought she was just concerned and trying to keep me safe, so I gently pulled my hand away and told her that I don't like holding hands with anyone other than my parents. That was when she said something that I'll never forget. She said, "I could be your mom," and then tried to laugh it off as a joke. But even as a 9-year-old, I could tell that something was wrong. I slyly tried to walk away from the woman as I continued to look for my mom because I was getting really uncomfortable at that point. And when I started walking in practically the opposite direction of the woman, she called out for me and said that she saw my parents. I looked back at her and saw her pointing toward the cars on the side of the road on the outskirts of the Harvest Festival. I looked over to see my parents, but I still couldn't seem to find them. But before I could call back to the lady, she had already stepped toward me and began to basically drag me away from the crowd of people toward the cars. I thought something was wrong, but I just assumed that she was still trying to help and ended up giving in and walking with her toward the car. Thankfully, that was when I heard my name called out from behind me, and when I looked, I could see my dad running over to me from the crowd of people behind us. I looked back up to the lady who I thought was helping me, and I'll never forget the angry look that she had on her face before she let go of me and took off running. She didn't have to go far though, because it seemed like she was actually leading me to her car and not my parents'. Who knows what would have happened to me if my dad hadn't seen her trying to pull me away from the Harvest Festival.